Hello, everybody. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for the introduction, Jesse. So just going back to what Jesse said, she said that either you got to be good looking or funny, and makes me wonder why I'm up here to present. In any regard, we got a couple of Métis settlement members that are in the crowd, and hopefully, if you get to meet one of them, if you don't know what the Métis settlements are or what they're about. I'll give you the best I can for a description as to why they're here and well, actually, let's get a show of hands. Who in the room knows what the Métis settlements are? So we got a very small amount. Actually, I'm surprised. We've been around for quite a while, and this is actually, I mean, if we go back historically to see exactly how we came about. I mean, if you know anything about the Métis people, they were called at one point in time the road allowance people because there's no necessarily any land or anything that the Métis people were associated with. So we didn't have an area to call home per se. And it relates back to where we came from, where most of the Métis people started up in the Winnipeg area, obviously, and everybody knows about the Métis Rebellion. As a part of the Métis Betterment Act, about 80 years ago, the Alberta government decided to allocate certain locations for Métis people to go and move and create homesteads. At some point in time, my history is not the greatest on that regard, but there was a creation of 12 Métis settlements that were allocated to the Métis people to move. A number of those, and we'll see them actually on part of the presentation once we get it going here. There was Touchwood Lake, Marlborough, Wolf Lake, a few of those other spots that were actually out there. So it was 12 Métis settlements. And then they rescinded 4 of those settlements, and they were taken back to the Alberta government under Alberta government's wing. And for whatever reason, they said there was no schools, there was no ability for to be able to live there and whatnot. And now we see today that these particular pieces of land are either highly developed or otherwise. So it resulted to in 8 Métis settlements that are still active today, and they called it the Métis Settlement Accord when they did the signing. There was a lot of funding that came with that for us to be able to develop and the infrastructure, homes, everything like that to get our people set in a community environment and to benefit ourselves, whether it be schools and everything else that would come along with it. So make sure we had access to not only land that can't be taken from us, but also like access to healthcare and schools and everything like that. So there was a train of thought when the Alberta government created them, and as a result, through legislation, the Métis Settlements Act of Alberta, that's where our legislative authority comes from, and that created the Métis Settlements General Council. So the Métis Settlements General Council is made up of each settlement. So there's 8 settlements in there. Those 8 settlements get together and they create legislation that each settlement has to abide by, depending on what it is, whether it's development of land or other things. But everybody has their voice. Everybody has a say into how things are going to happen that way. So the Métis settlements are unique to Alberta, in case anybody didn't know. There's no other Métis settlements anywhere in Canada or the world for that matter. So that's the uniqueness of the Métis settlements. And we are a land-based Métis, which gives us, under another Alberta driven thing, which is asserted credibility. So we have asserted credibility for consultation purposes when we talk about oil and gas development and everything else that comes with the consultation process that is also applicable to every other First Nation that's particularly in Alberta. And a lot of, you've seen a few of the presentations already. There's a lot of development that goes on in Alberta, and we are obviously the northeastern section of that area is where we are residing. Buffalo Lake is an hour and a half, as the bird flies, I guess, northeast of Edmonton. So a lot of that oil extraction is basically out of our backyard. We do have significant documented land uses all the way from really basically Manitoba to the ocean. So that's Buffalo Lake. I hope you get a chance to speak to some of the other members that are in the area, and I'm going to point out one at least I know. She's I want to say yeah, Peavine. Now Peavine's way up north, so they're a lot more northern than we are. But she's consultation officer here from Peavine. And I'm sorry, I'm bad with names, so. I know your name. I'm sorry. We meet regularly, but Lynn, sorry. It just slipped my mind. Anyway, Lynn's from Métis Settlement. I got my team over there, Tim, Lyle, and Janessa. They're also from Buffalo Lake, and they work with me extensively on different programs. So I'm not too sure how much longer I'm going to have to carry this. I'm going to have to start telling jokes here. I didn't get paid for stand-up. Are we good to go? All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Carrie. She can talk a little bit about herself, and then I'm going to take over again and just go through a couple of the slides.
Thank you, Roy, for carrying the ball here for a little bit. My name's Carrie, as already mentioned. I am not an expert in IPCAs. I'm honored here, though, today to just share with you what I've learned over the last several months working with the Métis settlements. And so if you, I think maybe I'll just stand over here. If you haven't heard, oh my gosh. Oh, yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I think the first slide is about what is an IPCA, an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area. And so is it? Oh, good grief. Isn't that it? Okay. So there's a few, I guess the IPCA is a tool. It was identified by the Indigenous Circle of Experts as a tool to achieve Pathway to Target 1, which is a biodiversity target. 17% of the lands in Canada would be protected and conserved through some sort of tool such as an IPCA. So that's kind of where it's been identified, but one of there's I guess 3 cornerstones or things that are really important to IPCAs that they said. So there are areas of land and water where Indigenous peoples and governments have the long-term commitment to protect and conserve. The second part is that they're Indigenous-led. So it's not something that the government comes in and says, you must do this and you must do that. They're Indigenous-led. They propose the objectives. They propose, kind of the boundaries, the management, and the governance part of it. And the other key to an IPCA is it's about protecting or valuing Indigenous knowledge, culture, and language. So that's also part of a IPCA. I think Roy was going to talk a little bit more. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, a little bit about why the MSGC had gotten involved in IPCA, or why they're pursuing a feasibility study, which we're going to talk about as well. Just really quickly, if you don't mind, I'll share some of the things that I've learned as I talk to communities. So I've talked to some Métis settlements. I've talked to some other stakeholders that are non-Indigenous, trappers associations, landowners, governments, environmental organizations. And some of the things that have come up that I think is valuable to mention is, one of it is there's no one way to manage or govern an IPCA. There's not a model out there to use. Believe me, I've looked for it, a template to follow. And this is because it's not a one-size-fits-all, that there's each community has its own jurisdiction, its own politics, its own values, and those types of things all get considered when you're developing or proposing an IPCA. The second part is that that I've learned that a misconception is it's about restricting access, or only Indigenous people can use these lands once identified as a IPCA, and that's not true at all. The MSGC certainly isn't proposing that. That, you know, in many examples that I've seen, that non-Indigenous users, you know, recreational hunters, that kind of thing, also can use these lands. The third one misconception is that it's about restricting all development, no matter what it is. Certainly, most of them are about restricting kind of that more extractive, that big industry development, for sure. That's why most of the communities want to establish an IPCA, but some of them are considering, well, what kind of sustainable development can still happen? You know, is there tourism opportunities? Is there you know, community events that we can still have in these areas? And that certainly can be included in an IPCA, and something that the MSGC is considering.
So, if we could just go back to that misconceptions slide there, what we have, Carrie mentioned some of the meetings that had gone on with a couple of the communities, and what we ended up finding is that a couple of these areas, you get these reeves and the local politicians that are, or even the MLAs now, that are spreading misconception and conjecture that it's not applicable necessarily to the IPCA project or the proposal. It's just a proposal. It's a feasibility study to see what exactly can we look at to inject this type of conservation. And the meetings were not the greatest, so that's why we're here today, to try to, you know, spread the proper messaging out there, which is not what you know, these guys that are running these meetings are saying, which is not to restrict. We have one MLA that's boasting that oh, it's going to cost 20 to 60,000 jobs, which is not true. It's not the goal of the IPCA. The goal is to make sure that we can do this in a manner in which is respectful, obviously, and conserves. And it also has to be an Indigenous-driven initiative. Because of our connection historically to that. So if we can move to the next one. I think you talked about the what you've learned from others. There's a lot of stuff when we talk about why our reasons for, and I can speak for Buffalo Lake's reasoning behind the areas, and you'll see them here shortly about why we're hoping to get a particular area you know, designated for Indigenous protection, and it results around that's very close to our community. And so when I'm talking about why our community reasons is because we actually were removed from that particular piece of land, and we were told, okay, now you got to come to Buffalo Lake, which at the time it was Kikino East or West, Kikino West at the time. So that's part of the reason is that, I mean, if we can move to the next slide, is that, this is an example that Carrie's going to discuss. I guess maybe I will let her talk about it before we move into the actual land locations and the reasonings behind the importance.
So, okay, so this example, Adese Deco First Nations, if I've mispronounced that, my apologies. But Jesse wanted me to bring up this example as it's one of the first, I guess, formally designated IPCAs in Canada in the Northwest Territories. And so the people there had recognized the importance for protecting the ecosystem and the waters, the wetlands, the wildlife, and for their use in terms of food and for spiritual gatherings. In October of 2018, they did sign an agreement with the federal government so that these lands would be co-managed. And it's now designated as a national wildlife area, and the management is through this IPCA. So what I have learned about this in particular is there's a guardianship program And that's about, they monitor the ecological habitat and they implement a youth mentoring program as well as some stewardship monitoring in that area. And they've also established a management board where there's 4 members from the Deco First Nation and 1 member from the Government of Canada. And then there's all sorts of things in that agreement that you can find on the internet for sure if you're interested. The second example is an Alberta example. It's not formally called an IPCA, but I think for all intents and purposes it sort of follows the model of an IPCA and the 3 cornerstones that I mentioned in terms of, it was recognized by the Indigenous community. The next one is the Kataskanou-Nawini Wildland Provincial Park. So this is, the area is south of Wood Buffalo National Park. And it's a collaboration between the Indigenous people and the government and industry in that area. So there is an industry that had given up their mineral rights to add to the park. And the management intent of this area is it supports Indigenous activities. It also supports other non-Indigenous, or everybody can use it for camping, wildlife, hiking. And it's also protected for wildlife and other ecological values like watershed protection, etc. So now I think we're going to get into specifically what we've been doing with the Métis Settlements General Council, a specific feasibility study, and it's in the area close to Buffalo Lake, Kikino, Fishing Lake, and Elizabeth. Yes, those are the 4 Métis settlements that it's close to. So we're going to just kind of go through what that feasibility study looks like and what the types of things that they're interested in hearing about. Do you want me to do this one or? Yep. Okay. So the highlights is this is a proposed idea by the MSGC. I'll tell you a bit of a story of why we created this slide. So we're talking to a lot of communities, and there's a lot of, again, folks out there that think they know what the MSGC is trying to do, and they're talking about it, and when we go out and talk to them, a lot of these kinds of questions come up. So we thought it would be best just, with the MSGC, just to kind of say, okay, this is what it's about. This isn't what it's, what it's not about. And also the, that it's an idea right now. Like it's not they're not moving forward. It's not an established IPCA. The areas that they're talking about, they're not talking about conserving the whole area, but parcels of those areas, and they want to identify those through a feasibility study. At this time also, it was important to note that there's no commitment from the provincial government to an IPCA, but there is, they are aware of it. So, they know this is going on. And the study that we're doing, it will inform, the feasibility study will inform the MSGC, and they'll decide if they want to proceed with an IPCA or proposing an IPCA to the provincial government. And I guess, the other thing that I had would like to, mention is that they're not proposing to restrict non-Indigenous use in these areas either. Other hunters, trappers, hikers that are already in these areas, they can continue to do that. Well, that's what the MSGC would propose. So just in case, and just for the process that we're doing, it's the feasibility study is about exploring what's possible. We've gathered a lot of information in terms of, including, how is the land currently used by settlement members, by other Indigenous communities in the area, by non-Indigenous, what's been done elsewhere. There's a pre-feasibility study that that's been completed that gathers information from about 40 emerging IPCAs across Canada, or existing, IPCA models across Canada. And right now, next slide, please. Right now, we're in that stakeholder engagement, gathering information from various people in those communities. And then so the next step would be, okay, then we would say, or the MSGC would take all that information in and they'd say, okay, what can be done? What kind of resources would be needed?
So the two study areas that we're talking about here, and so when you say the MSGC, I think the reason why that the funding was approved from the feds there is because it focuses more engagement with more people, more communities. Their dollar value is better accounted for, I suppose. The two study areas being Wolf Lake and the Lakeland area, which is much larger than the second area, which is North Buck and Amisk Lake, which is North Buck is just north. You'll see on the map here soon. Of course, the Métis settlement, so we have that connection there. It's spiritually, culturally, everything. And so study area A is Wolf Lake. You see how large it is. And then study area B, they're both kind of in the same area. Not quite as large as those other IPCAs. I mean, you may have heard at the news that these the $800 million coming from the feds that just was announced yesterday, I believe, for similar projects. So I'm anticipating that's where this is coming from. Next slide, yeah. Here we have historic context. And when we talk historically, from the Wolf Lake portion of it, like I said, they did have a settlement there. There's actually we've done site visits to each of these areas as part of the GC. Like a number of our communities came out, members. We were actually on the lake and went out. There's a graveyard on the north side of Wolf Lake, and Touchwood. There's a number of homesteads and even current contemporary use being the cabins and trap lines in the area. So lots of land use. I mean, I want to point out this particular area here. So if we look at Wolf Lake in where it's at and where our settlement was, which was on the south side, it was taken, and they said, "Oh, well, there's nothing there for you. There was no schools, no access to hospital. Let's move you out." And so look at it as if it was your piece of property. And then you come back there years later and you see all the development that's gone on there. You can appreciate where our train of thought is that this is not acceptable. I mean, there was no control over it. It's free game for industry to reach out and you know, there's oil here. I'm going to put pad here, pad over there, and I'm going to extract anything that I can to get my dollar out of here, without care and without you know, the reclamation aspect of it. Nobody's looking after them and directing them. Either they're using it extensively or they're turning it into something else after it's gone through, or not. So I can speak mostly about the North Buck Lake and Amisk. I mean, I know personally my father's born on the north side of North Buck Lake, and that's where the settlement was. We had a home there and everything like that. So it's and the area actually is quite extensively used nowadays. Recreation is a lot to do in this particular area. There's a lot of sand dunes and you know, ATVing and quadding. We used to go berry picking up there. The bushes used to be like as high as this high for berries. Now there's actually zero to none there, unless you're really deep far into the woods where nobody can get to. So tourism actually played a lot of into that damage that was created there. And of course, there's nobody there watching them either. There are people coming with cabin country that are cutting down trees left, right, and center, and perfectly good ones, so they can dry them up and burn them whenever they come down from the city. So we have extensive use along the Amisk side as well, which is also developed would be to the west. I guess west side of the lake is more so developed than the east, but very close to us, and it's close and dear to our hearts, and that's why we have an obligation to make sure that we, as Buffalo Lake, get it on the action and make sure that our voices are heard when it comes to anything that goes on there. It's not about taking everything away. We do develop in our own community as well, but it's done responsibly, and we want to make sure that message is spread across there for everybody.
Okay, so what we understand, what we need to do, what's our job ahead. So we do understand that, you know, there needs to be some sort of a I guess, support from the provincial government, because it is Crown lands, or the federal government if it was federal land, that these areas, they're busy landscapes. There's leaseholders, there's private landowners, there's cottagers, recreationers, there's like the tourists, like that you had mentioned, Roy. And the land uses vary from kind of that, people going out hiking and enjoying nature, to industries definitely there. There's major oil and gas industry. Alpac is in, I think it's study area A, closer to Wolf Lake. And, some other considerations is that there's, there potentially, it could help government, there's those connections to government policy, I guess, in terms of climate policy, water policy, land use, and wetlands. So some of the things that were being brought up in some of the stakeholder groups that we were mentioning is like, well, have you considered how this fits into the Cold Lake land use management plan, which does identify how that implementation should include more Indigenous input. But that's a positive step, I guess, but this is a perfect example, in my opinion, of how you would implement that Cold Lake management plan, not just plan to plan. Anyways, so the second slide is just some more considerations. Retain and enhance Indigenous culture and historic connections. So we know that there's a cemetery, there's old homesteads, there's trails that go around both of the goes around for sure Wolf Lake. I think there's more around Buck Lake and Amisk. There's opportunities to collaborate with other Indigenous communities, and we've certainly reached out to the First Nations, the MNA in these areas. There's potential for wetland and habitat restoration, and the Métis settlements, they're already doing some some guardianship type monitoring in these communities. They've gone out and they've put wildlife cameras out in these areas. They're also out on the land on a regular basis. And the people that I've heard from in these communities have noticed that there is a decline in population of wildlife, or a decline in fish that they're fishing from these lakes. And they're concerned about it, not only for their own generation, but for generations to come, and for their grandchildren, for their great-grandchildren. And they feel, what they've told me, is that if they do nothing, that it won't be there for the future generations. These are the questions that we ask. So we'll maybe skip to the next slide and then come back to this one, because I think we'll have time for some questions and maybe a little bit of a discussion on IPCAs, what you think of this. I'd be interested to hear from you. So our next steps are to have a report for the MSGC by the end of December. Generally speaking, with the exception of Indigenous communities, our stakeholder engagement has concluded, but we'll keep the survey open. So there is a survey. So it says, complete the survey for us. I'm gonna give you my email, and if you'd like to do the survey, send me an email and I'll send it back to you. It's online. I do also have a couple of paper copies that I'm just at one of the back tables, so if you come find me, you can fill out a paper copy too if you're interested. And it just, if you use these areas, we really do want to hear from you. And so the MSGC will take the report, the feasibility report, and they will share it with the provincial government, and it'll include, recommendations on how to include Indigenous culture, knowledge, and language. And it'll also include what parcels of land would be feasible for an IPCA, but also what are really valuable for an IPCA from the settlement's perspective, for sure. So, I don't know, do you, yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, good spiel. I just wanted to bring it back to the importance of the connection. And so part of my role at Buffalo Lake is a consultation officer. So, and through that we have to do land use studies, depending on the particular project or wherever it's at, or however we want to establish ourselves to have this discussion with any proponents. And through those land use studies, we interview our members, and a lot of we've lost a lot of our elders this in this last couple of years. I mean, COVID was tough. There was a lot of circumstance that we didn't get information that we should have actually kind of retained, and but I was happy actually. I had one elder that I was doing an interview with just to record, and he's actually extended care, all this kind of stuff. But I wanted to record his interview, and he said when we talk about this North Buck and Amisk Lake area, he owned a piece of land that was right on the lake. It was on the west side, in the Bruno Bay area, but it was his quarter section of land at that time, and when as a result of, because we had Métis supervisors, you'll look at our resource center, our museum, I guess we call it, at Buffalo Lake. We have a lot of paperwork that relates to the Métis supervisor. So as a result of whatever happened in the war, whatever, Métis people were deemed, I guess needed to be supervised. So every community had a Métis supervisor, and the Métis supervisor had to write letters depending on what was owed, or what that community member needed to do. One of them I remember looking at was, well, you didn't get wood for the school this year, so you're cut off at the store. So that was a letter that was actually imposed on one of our members. And the other one, so getting back to this land that this other member owned, he had an account at the store, the local Caslin general store. And as a result of his bill that was not paid, I don't even know how much it was at the time. It was obviously not very much in the grand scheme of things nowadays. But and as a result of that, he had to sign over his land to pay off that bill, and they lost it. And nowadays, that piece of land, that piece of property is very valuable. Obviously, there's lots of cottage country there, right? So we talk about that kind of connection and that kind of ability that we should have had. It should have been ours, but it's not. So we have this argument regularly with the government of Alberta, and why it's so important to us. And they're, you know how the government is. They like to appease, I guess, sometimes. And I think that's one of the only reasons why we still kind of manage that provincial recreation area that's under Buffalo Lake. So I mean, you see the connection there when we talk about how strongly we are in regards to this area. We want to make sure that everybody gets that message. So we don't get that conjecture, that misinterpretation that we're trying to do this for this reason, to stop everything. It's about our connection. And we want to make sure that message gets across. Thank you.